This material argues that global climate alarmism is fading due to shifting public priorities, failed catastrophic predictions, and ineffective policies, suggesting that society should instead focus on green energy research and development. But jumping right in, relying heavily on public opinion polls and political rhetoric to debunk a scientific crisis risks conflating a change in narrative with a change in physical reality.
Yeah, that is exactly the weakness here. I mean, the opening of this piece leans intensely on the idea that, well, because people care less about climate change right now, the problem itself is therefore less severe.
Right.
The KEX cites U.S. voters ranking it 28th out of 30 problems, and African surveys placing it 31st out of 34, and, media mentions hitting a 3-year low in 2025.
Yeah, which creates a pretty massive logical gap.
Exactly, proving that the Davos crowd or just everyday citizens have this, climate fatigue, or that they are currently distracted by the war in Ukraine or inflation. It doesn't inherently prove that the physical threat of climate change is actually exaggerated.
No, not at all.
For a deeply knowledgeable audience, using sociological data to try and dismiss a climatological argument, it just actively weakens the foundation of the whole piece. You literally cannot use a poll to argue with a thermometer.
That's a great way to put it. Readers notice that sleight of hand immediately.
Oh, for sure. And they just start to distrust the narrator right out of the gate.
Well, as I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that declining interest equals a declining threat. But couldn't we compare this to, pandemic fatigue?
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
Just because people stopped worrying about a virus to focus on pocketbook issues didn't mean the virus vanished, right? It just meant the cost-benefit calculus of worrying about it shifted. How do we tighten this up in the text?
That pandemic analogy is perfect, actually. It hits the nail on the head, and it highlights exactly what's missing in the prose right now. So my suggestion here is to explicitly distinguish between public fatigue and empirical danger.
Okay, so separating the two?
Right. We need to help the author reframe how they are using this polling data. Instead of presenting the surveys as proof that climate change isn't a problem, they should frame them as proof that the alarmist messaging strategy has fundamentally failed to resonate with the public's hierarchy of needs.
I see, so it's an indictment of the messaging, not the science.
Exactly. When you make that slight pivot, the polling data completely transformed. It goes from being this highly vulnerable, easily dismissed argument against the science into a really sharp, undeniable weapon against the current policy approach.
Which is a much stronger angle. So instead of trying to convince the reader that the climate isn't changing, the writer sort of concedes that reality, but proves that screaming about the apocalypse is just a terrible political strategy.
Yeah, precisely.
If I were editing this, here is one concrete example of how they could tackle it. You could add a transition clarifying this right after the stats. Something like, while the climate continues to change, the public's tolerance for panic has plummeted.
Oh, I love that. That single sentence seals the logical gap entirely.
Right? You acknowledge the thermometer, but you indict the megaphone.
Yes. And the piece really needs to carry that logic directly into how it handles the international data, too. Particularly that African survey they mention.
Oh, yeah. Where it ranks 31st out of 34.
Right. The text just leaves that statistic hanging there as this sort of gotcha moment. But you have to contextualize that survey by explicitly stating that immediate survival needs like unemployment, paved roads, and electricity, they naturally eclipse long-term environmental concerns.
Makes total sense.
So by explaining this hierarchy of need, the writer makes a powerful, undeniable point, which is that demanding expensive climate policies is actively harmful to developing nations' immediate survival.
Yeah, it shifts the focus completely. Instead of the reader thinking, oh, these people don't care about the climate, it becomes, these people literally can't afford to care about the climate when they don't have roads or a power grid.
Exactly. It makes the argument deeply empathetic rather than just purely statistical.
Which is so much more persuasive. And, speaking of who can afford to care, that brings us right into how the author chooses their targets. Moving on to the next major point, leaning primarily on the most extreme failed predictions of high-profile figures makes the counterargument feel predictable and vulnerable to dismissal by critics.
Yeah, this brings us to a really major issue with the text's rhetorical target. The weakness is just glaringly visible in the roster of opponents the text chooses to attack.
Right. They go after some pretty easy targets.
Very easy. Citing King Charles' 18-month warning from 2019, or Al Gore's 10-year warning from 2008, or, observing that Greta Thunberg has moved on to other causes. It attacks the absolute most hyperbolic versions of climate advocacy.
It's building a massive straw man.
Exactly. It's a huge straw man. And similarly, the text points out that 187 million people won't be displaced by sea level rise because they will obviously adapt.
Right.
But that assumes the opponent's argument is utterly devoid of nuance. It acts as if climate scientists literally think humans will just stand still like statues as the water rises up to their chins for a century.
Which ignores the much more moderate, credible scientific consensus.
Right. And that weakens the persuasive power for an audience that isn't already deeply skeptical. When you only fight the weakest, most sensationalized version of an opponent's argument, the reader just wonders if you're actually capable of fighting the strongest one.
But wait, let's look closely at the section discussing the 1,500 climate policies across 41 countries.
Oh, right, that part.
Is there a risk that focusing solely on activists like Greta Thunberg or King Charles might overlook the fact that massive institutional governments are the ones actually enacting these deeply flawed policies? Shouldn't the text take aim at the institutional science rather than just the celebrities?
Yes, absolutely. It feels like they are hunting mice while elephants are trampling the garden. The text buries this highly compelling statistic that out of 1,500 global policies, only a tiny fraction actually work, beneath a really easy pop culture dunk.
Yeah, and that totally undermines their credibility with the sophisticated audience.
For sure. So my suggestion here is to strengthen the argument's credibility by engaging with and dismantling a steel-manned version of the opposing view.
A steel-manned version?
Right, the strongest possible version of the climate argument, the one held by serious institutional economists, infrastructure planners, and scientists. You have to dismantle that, rather than just dunking on the celebrity outlier.
Okay, I see. So you prove that even when you grant the opposition their best points, their proposed policy solutions still fail.
Exactly.
I can see a few ways the writer could execute this steelman strategy. Like, as a concrete example, they could briefly concede a widely accepted consequence of climate change, such as the reality of shifting agricultural zones.
Right, just own it.
Yeah, acknowledge that reality, and then explain why investing billions in green R&D is still a significantly more effective response than the $16 trillion spent on failed policies.
Yes, you win the argument on policy efficacy, not by denying the underlying physical shift. It shows the reader that the author isn't afraid of the facts, they just deeply disagree on the optimal human response.
Right. Are there other ways to apply this?
Yeah, another concrete way involves that sea level rise. Instead of just stating that levees solve sea level rise as if it's some casual weekend project, acknowledge the massive, multi-billion-dollar cost of building levees.
Put the massive price tag right there on the page.
Exactly. Steelman the economic burden of adaptation, but then mathematically demonstrate how that massive adaptation cost is still vastly cheap and more realistic than attempting to completely re-engineer the entire global economy to lower global temperature.
Oh, that's clever. By conceding the heavy cost of adaptation up front, you build incredible trust.
Yeah, you're saying, look, yes, this will be incredibly expensive and difficult, but the alternative is completely impossible.
I love that. Okay, so we fixed the messaging problem, and we've stopped attacking straw men by engaging with institutional realities. But even if the author nails all of that, none of it matters if the final economic solution falls flat. Which brings us to the last major point.
Right.
Presenting the future impact of climate change purely as a minor deduction in global GDP growth misses the visceral human element required to make a persuasive conclusion resonate.
This is so important. The economic argument is supposed to be the climax of the piece, right? The grand synthesis?
Yeah.
But the weakness here is that the script builds to this climax, claiming that in the year 2100, instead of the average person being 450% richer, climate change means they will only be 435% as rich.
Which, mathematically, based on the cited climate economists, is sound.
It is sound, but this abstract macroeconomic percentage is just so emotionally detached. It completely fails to convey what that 15% relative drop actually means for human lives.
Right. It ends a very human-focused piece on a really cold statistical note.
Exactly. Earlier they brought up poverty, hunger, and heat deaths, and then they end on we'll be 435% richer. Humans don't live in percentages. They live in houses,
and communities and local economies.
That makes total sense. But wait, could the evidence also support a different conclusion? Like, if the world is generally 435% richer, couldn't a critic argue that a 15% relative drop in wealth could disproportionately devastate the exact poorest regions, like Africa, mentioned earlier in the text?
Oh, 100%.
Grid they were promised.
Yes, exactly. The math feels too clean, right? It's detached from the messy reality of global inequality. And that is exactly the kind of pushback a sophisticated reader will generate the second they see those numbers.
So how do we fix that conclusion?
The suggestion here is to translate these macroeconomic statistics into tangible, localized outcomes that align with the author's overarching goal.
Which is proving that adaptation and prosperity are better than expensive climate panic.
Right. They have to take that 435% figure out of the spreadsheet and put it into the dirt. Explain the how and the why behind the math without sounding callous about the losses that will occur.
Give me some concrete examples of what that looks like on the page.
Well, explain what being 435% richer actually looks like on the ground in 2100. Describe how, despite climate shifts, a farmer in a developing nation will still have access to cheap, reliable power and air conditioning.
Okay, so showing that the climate shift is rendered manageable purely by wealth.
Exactly. You frame the economic growth not just as a bonus, but as the ultimate climate defense shield.
That's a great shift in tone. Could they also compare it to current problems?
Yeah, another way is to contrast the abstract 2 to 3% GDP loss from climate change directly against the concrete devastation caused by energy poverty today.
Oh, showing that stunting economic growth right now through expensive policies does more immediate harm than the projected climate costs of the future?
Yes. You ground the math in the morality of human flourishing. If the author just says, "We'll still be rich, so don't worry," they sound like a disconnected elite.
Right. It comes off terribly.
But if they say, "We cannot sacrifice the immediate alleviation of global poverty today for a fractional temperature decrease a century from now," they sound like a humanist. You have to remind the reader that wealth is what builds hospitals and seawalls.
It brings the entire argument full circle, tying the abstract economics right back to the human cost.
Exactly.
Let's do a quick recap of the ground we've covered today. We started by identifying the need to ensure a clear distinction between declining public interest and actual scientific threat, using the polling data to prove the failure of the messaging, not the absence of the climate reality.
Right.
Then, we discussed steel-manning the opposition's arguments rather than relying on celebrity straw men, engaging with institutional policy failures instead of just dunking on Greta Thunberg.
Crucial step.
And finally, we looked at grounding those abstract macroeconomic GDP statistics in concrete human realities, ensuring the conclusion resonates morally by showing what that future wealth actually buys.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fundamentally strong piece of material. If the writer takes these changes to heart, they go from just complaining about climate activists to actually proving a massive, undeniable economic point.
While we warmly invite the listener to implement these actionable suggestions, revise the material, and submit their work back in again for a future critique. Keep up the great work, and we'll catch you next time.